Hello, my name's Luke Walton. I'm a producer and I lead a small team that runs the Pitch Film Fund and delivers productions through Real Issues Films. Welcome back to the Climb podcast, which is a trek through the Beatitudes, a series of short, pithy, enigmatic statements recorded as being given by Jesus of Nazareth in his so-called Sermon on the Mount. Hence, the climb. You see what we did there. Well, you're welcome to start with this podcast, but this is not actually the beginning. There is an introductory podcast and my guests feature in that. So if you'd like to go back there, and even better, if you'd like to watch the 8 short documentary films produced for us by Bedlam Productions, you will find that helpful and also will stop us from putting plot spoilers into the conversation here. The opening podcast introduces what the Beatitudes are, their significance, when they were given, by whom, and why. And we talked a bit about how they work as blessings, and we touched on some of the revolutionary nature of them. But since then, our journey has taken us to make these 8 short documentary, and it's been quite a challenge. It's taken us through stories of persecution, of violence, of loss, of grief, around mental health and poverty and issues of climate crisis. And we've touched on changed lives and challenging encounters and considered renowned and ancient works of art. So we've done quite a big journey along the line, and we're hugely grateful to Bedlam Productions and the work that they've put in on doing that. And we're going to contemplate some of those in turn. As I said, the introduction in the first podcast, we hope these are only the first steps on what will be a journey to a mountaintop view, a longer form cinematic exploration of these statements. What would that look like? How would that feel? What might be the stories we would tell to bring these statements to life? So in this podcast, we want to reflect on the documentaries a little and how that might prepare us for the journey ahead. So I want to welcome back our panel from the opening podcast: Ginny MacDonald, Director of Theos, the London-based think tank; Rebecca Eklund, she's a Professor of Theology at Loyola University, Maryland, and author of The Beatitudes Through the Ages; and Sam Wells, Vicar of St. Martin's in the Field since 2012. I also want to welcome a new contributor to the panel, Professor Jolyon Mitchell. Professor Mitchell's research and teaching focuses on religion, violence, and peace building, with particular reference to the arts, film, theatre, radio, visual arts, as well as other new and old media, and he's written and published extensively on those and related areas. He served on ecumenical panels at leading European film festivals and has just moved from Edinburgh to a new post at the University of Durham. Jolyon, it's wonderful to welcome you.
Great to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Jolyon, I mentioned European film festivals and ecumenical panels. Can you just tell us a little where you've served on those?
I had the privilege and pleasure to serve on international film juries, ecumenical juries at Venice, at Cannes, and at Berlin, and also in Locarno. And one of the great things about that was it allows you to work together with a number of film critics, film experts, as well as filmmakers, and watch maybe 50 films in 10 days. So you get a good window onto filmmaking all around the world.
Thank you. And think about these little films. I mean, I'd love to think of them at any of those festivals. That's in mighty company. What was your reaction in general to the films you've just seen?
I really enjoyed watching them. For me, they were like small windows onto huge texts, which illuminated the text in often quite different ways than I thought they would. In other words, my expectations for the films were not fulfilled, but I was taken down different routes that I was expecting to go, and that was pleasing and thought-provoking.
Great. Well, we'll come to some of those thoughts as we go together through each of these films. In this podcast, we're going to go through each of the Beatitudes in turn, following the order in Matthew. But first, I want to ask Sam, in the first podcast, you talked about somehow us living in the comma in the Beatitudes. They have a statement and then they have a response, and we somehow live between the beginning statement and the ending statement. But how might we really hope these Beatitudes would shape and change our society? Have they been overlooked for that? Should they be doing more in our society?
Well, I think the fundamental conviction of the Beatitudes is that they do shape and change our society in two ways. First of all, they are more or less Jesus's autobiography. All the things on the left-hand side, as it were, before the comma, are the things that take place in Jesus's life, and all the things on the right-hand side are the things that he destines for us. So obviously, if you're a Christian, you think Jesus fundamentally shapes and changes our society. The second way in which I think it's a matter of faith that they shape and change our society is that you can say that on the left-hand side of the comma is the cross, and on the right-hand side of the comma is the resurrection. And if there is one aspect of Jesus' life and ministry that we associate with change, it's the cross and the resurrection. And it's fundamental to Christianity that whether or not those changes are visible and tangible, they are nonetheless real. So there's no question that they shape and change our society. But there's also a very big reason why there would be resistance to change. And I wouldn't get into a declension narrative by which we say back in the day they did shape and change our society and somehow that's been lost, for the simple reason that there's always vested interests in keeping things the way they are. And the Beatitudes are fundamentally saying things are not the way they appear. So if you take the analogy of buying or renting an apartment or flat, you move in and you look at the color of the bathroom or the way they've arranged the kitchen. You say, I don't know what the people here thought they were doing. I wouldn't have a pink bathroom for all the tea in China or whatever. And, everybody does that when they move into a new place. Well, the truth is that it is the way it was because the previous occupants liked it that way. And if you're a vicar like I am and you take over a church and you think, I don't know why they have a service at such a stupid time on a Sunday, and why on earth don't they have a weekday evening service like normal churches? Well, the answer is always because that's the way they like it. And if you're going to change that, you're going to be in trouble or you're going to have to face some conflict. So likewise, things are the way in society because the preponderance of the powerful people in society more or less like them that way. Otherwise, the powerful people in society would choose to change them. And things are not as the Beatitudes portray them to be, and it suits the powers that be to keep them just as they are, which is why they still are that way. And Beatitudes are a profoundly subversive thing, not simply saying things need to change, but saying the reality of things is actually very different from how they appear. Well, of course, that's a story that those in control want to suppress.
Yeah, thank you. Rebecca, you've written and studied the Beatitudes a great deal, so I feel a little bit of trepidation in asking this question. But having watched the films, was there something that anything that struck you afresh, an insight or a thought about the films that gave you something new on the Beatitudes?
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that struck me afresh was just the interconnectedness of all the Beatitudes, in terms of how they relate to one another, how they flow into one another, how certain Beatitudes need the other Beatitudes to function well. So there were a few examples of that really struck me, and one of them was in the hunger and thirst documentary, the blessing on the hunger and thirst for justice or for righteousness, that the person being interviewed said, well, there's a kind of danger with the kind of zealousness for justice that it lapses into self-righteousness, or a kind of rigid journey for justice that overlooks mercy. And so justice also needs mercy. And I thought, what a lovely way to kind of talk about the blessing on the merciful in relation to the blessing on those who hunger for justice. And there were other examples. So the peacemakers, particularly in that documentary, their efforts to make peace subjected them to persecution, which shows kind of how peacemaking can actually be a dangerous activity that might flow into then the blessing on the persecuted. So I thought just some really wonderful lived examples of how the Beatitudes relate to one another and are very difficult to separate. I mean, it's actually very hard to consider them in isolation from one another, because you see how much they flow into one another and inform one another. So that I would say is one of the things that really struck me afresh from watching all of these documentaries.
That's a very interesting insight, because one of the things that was a constant conversation we were having as a team when the films were being developed was, which one is this about, when we were talking about someone? Because suddenly you would go, wait a minute, is this meekness, or is this righteousness, or is this poverty, or is this mercy? So there was a really interesting kind of conversation going around that. Chinny, I'd love to come and ask you the same question about the films. Did you see anything in them that was something fresh for you as well?
Yeah, what I really loved about them was that they felt very familiar. Even those who were from other countries or from kind of stories that I've heard about but not kind of been up close to, they felt like everyday people like me, or people that I might know or who might speak to. I might speak to. For most of them, there was just this very ordinary nature of them. These weren't kind of film stars or famous people who you might want to interview to kind of illustrate some of these Beatitudes, but they were just kind of very everyday. So I loved the simplicity of them. And yes, that one followed from the other, and the kind of beautiful insights and kind of small little phrases of these everyday people who were acting out the Beatitudes, but not necessarily badging themselves as acting those things out. The little insights that they gave. So the kind of climate activist who talks about the deep postures that are the Beatitudes. That for me helped to reframe again my understanding of the Beatitudes. They're deep postures. They're not kind of postures that they're not striking a pose. They're kind of deeply held ways of being in the world. Some that you would choose, that you deliberately choose, whether that's to live in a community or be a climate activist or do climate pilgrimages or become a priest, but some that you are plunged into, not for any reason that you would choose. So I think the everydayness of them, the humanness of them really spoke to me.
That's really interesting. Sam, can I come to you and I'll just ask, how do you think we cultivate the Beatitudes? Do you deliberately do this? Do you have to revisit them on a regular basis? How is it that we might cultivate them? There is an image, an ancient image of this as being the Beatitudes as being watered in a garden and growing as virtues. How do we cultivate them in our lives?
Well, one would be an attention to location and setting. If you are going to have a reward structure, if you're going to have a company celebration or organizational big love-in day, do you go to your, I mean, I'm talking in the UK context now, your sort of your national trust property, your prestige, classical columns place that looks like a palace, or do you go to a food bank? Do you go to a boxing gym in the East End of London? Do you go to the places that are disregarded? Do you go to a prison? Because by choosing to say this is where we think God is most evidently at work, and therefore this is where we're going to have our celebratory occasion, you are, in a sense, living the Beatitudes by saying we're going to relocate our imagination. But you have to let your imagination go to work. Where would be the right setting and what message are we sending? If you're having it at the posh place with the columns, then you're basically saying, the king is top of the tree and the prime minister is next down on the tree, and we're going to get as far up that pillar as we can to be as posh as we can. But the Beatitudes redefine posh. So location, I think, and then, who do you ask to do the opening address? You know, is it the poshest gong that you can, who will respond to your invitation? Or, you know, do you get a child to open? Do you get a refugee to open? Do you get a person who's searching for work to open the event? It's, you know, it's those kinds of things where you say, not patronizingly, oh, it's good to give the excluded a bit of a chance, but we think this is the kind of person through whom the Holy Spirit is most evidently working. And it is through the life this person is living that the life of the kingdom, the life of heaven, is most visible on earth. So it's those, you know, you have to use your imagination, but actually it's not incredibly hard once you put your imagination to work.
No, perhaps the biggest challenge is to our preconceived knowledge of how things should be and how they're set. You're just asking us to change our direction of view, in a sense, not to change the place we're in immediately, but to change our attitude and our posture. I would like to go through each of the Beatitudes in turn briefly and just see, for the benefit of this closing podcast, just ask a question about what are the insights that was brought out of each of the films. If I begin with "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." This was the story of Brother Sam living alongside the poor, both poor in spirit and in material terms in London. If I come to you perhaps first, Rebecca, what were the insights that you felt were brought out in that film?
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought it was just such a lovely example of someone who felt rich in so many ways. And in fact, he expresses that at the end of the film. He says, "I don't feel poor. I feel rich in relationship. I feel rich in community." And so, you know, to Sam's point earlier about, you know, this kind of overturning of expectations, or that, you know, the Beatitudes are really, in a sense, a kind of countercultural. He's sort of reversing what we typically see as riches and saying, I don't have those typical things, but I'm so rich. So that was one of the things that struck me. And I think the other thing that struck me is how much his decision to live, you know, this kind of very simple life connected him so deeply to creation. You know, he talked about the wonder, being able to really appreciate and soak in the wonder of the created world. You know, while he's working in his garden and weeding, and then saying, you know, that for him, being humble, being poor of spirit, is not thinking lowly of yourself, which I agree. Humility is not, oh, I am nothing, I am a worm, you know. But it's, for him, he said it was really touching base with who we are, which is that we're of the earth. Which of course goes back to the passage in Genesis about human beings being created literally from the dirt, from the soil. And so this kind of deep connection to creation that he felt in his decision to live this very simple, humble life, I found really striking.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting. Chinny, do you want to add anything to that? Was that one that struck you in a particular way?
Yeah, I think in that what was happening was precisely that relocating of imagination, a kind of offering a different way of doing life. I think so many of us have become so. I think so many of us have become so unimaginative about how life can be lived. So even when he was talking about, you know, we all pool our money, you know, we don't have money of our own, we kind of put it into this kind of collective pot, and the food is provided for us from that. This kind of offering a different way of being that is really rich and actually really liberating. The kind of sound of it is really liberating because it takes away that stress of striving for more and more and more. So yeah, that demonstration of an alternative way of imagining how to be.
Does any of that ring bells for you, Jolly, in cinematic terms?
The whole film for me rang many different bells. And it's not just sort of bells in churches, but bells in the ordinary, the everyday. We've seen it in the cheese being served, in the plants being dug up, in in the ordinariness of that garden next to a leisure centre, and the simplicity of what Brother Sam was wearing, and the simplicity of what he was saying as well. You will perhaps remember that he simply said, I feel really rich, even though vows of poverty. He's rich because he's rich in relationships. Then there's a whole cinematic tradition of the powerless, the poor, putting a question mark over the powerful. That can be anything from trading places, where all of a sudden the guy who's got nothing suddenly becomes rich and then interrogates all the rich people around, right through to the comedy of poverty that you can see in Charlie Chaplin, where he's almost like this fool figure, like an orthodox fool, or like a jester who puts another question mark over the power structures and the apparent riches. So for me, part of the power of this film and of other films that explore poverty is well, that actually there are some things that are far more important than possessions. You think of a classic old, I think it was 80s film, wasn't it? It was Arthur, 80s, 90s, hit with Dudley Moore, this man who seemed to have everything. And yet he realized that actually the one thing he truly lacked was love. And that was the thing that he needed. So he realized he was poor. And perhaps part of the power of the film is that it raises a question to each of us, each viewer, about what does it mean to be rich? What does it mean to be poor? So there's a subversive power in this film, and also in bigger budget films that we've seen. You could go right through a whole history of the underdog who puts a question mark over the powerful.
Thank you. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Jolyon, what did you think in this film told us about being comforted? What did Dan have to offer here?
For me, part of the power of this film was its truthfulness, that it reminded me much more, not of, you remember C.S. Lewis's famous sort of reflection on the problem of pain. It was not that. It was much closer to a grief observed, but a grief observed not necessarily from the griever, but the person who is alongside the person grieving. And that's part of the power of it. And for me, it captured some of the heartbreak, some of the way in which grief can ambush, can surprise, can come back and knock you over. And the difficulty that that raises for somebody involved in pastoring in that situation. So for me, part of the power of the film is the truthfulness of it, the simplicity of it, the way in which we were just introduced to one person who is involved with a lot of grief. But it's not necessarily his grief, it's other people's grief. And so it raises lots of questions about how do we stand alongside those who are grieving? How do we comfort those who are heartbroken? And part of the strength, another strength of the film for me, was that it didn't give easy answers to that. That sometimes it was just putting the kettle on, being there, sometimes knowing that you don't actually have the right words to say. So I think there's a power to this film in that it doesn't say, oh, it's easy to comfort, because it ain't easy. You know, if you lose the love of your life, or your child, or your parent, those are heartbreaking moments that no film, no words can take away. And in a way, again, it's a film that does a very different thing to all the theories about stages of grief and so on. It just says, here it is, and it's sometimes really horrible. And actually, part of the power of that is saying, is recognizing it's horrible. And it may be that the grief won't go away, but that you learn to live with it.
What were the insights that particularly struck you from that one, Ginny?
Well, I found that incredibly moving. And one of the things I was struck by was the bit that comes after the comma, which is, the blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And through his interactions with families who are grieving, with people who are taking their kind of final breaths, there is that moment of comfort that actually you can only receive if you are mourning, or if you are lacking in some way. That feeling of comfort only comes from the mourning that comes before. I was also struck by this idea that blessed are those who mourn. Who are those who mourn? Mourning looks extremely differently, depending on who you are, depending on what day it is in your kind of grief journey, depending on how you're feeling, depending on your culture. Mourning looks really different. And I loved how he talked about, I think there was one person who said, you know, are we allowed to do this at a funeral? And he kind of said, can do absolutely, pretty much do anything you want. And I think that recognition that there is not one singular way of being or of mourning. Also interested in it from our perspective at Theos, where we've done lots of research on death and dying, and how in a world of decreasing religiosity, there might not be those visible rituals that are related to the church or other kind of religious faiths that might hold people at those moments. So actually, mourning does look really differently today in 2024 in the UK. People are opting for different types of ways of saying goodbye or celebrating life, or going for direct cremations because of money, or actually thinking like they do need to hold on to that sense of comfort that comes from religious ritual. So yeah, very interested in the kind of the diversity of what mourning looks like, and the comfort that comes after that.
Thank you. There was a moment where Dan says, of course, people mourn for many things, and perhaps projects or dreams or hopes, other things that are lost. And indeed, when we will come to it shortly, but when we were looking at the Ghent altarpiece, one of the observations that Ben Quash brought was that in that painting, the people who are seen to be the mourners are the prophets. And the prophets' mourning was often over the state of society, over the condition of how things are. And this is where it gets very fluid, of course, because then is it about mourning for justice or mourning for righteousness or mourning for other things? But I wondered if you felt there were areas in. Does our loss of mourning for other people, does that also separate us almost from mourning for other things and our understanding of grief across society?
Yeah, I think so. I went direct to the kind of the most obvious sense of mourning. And I guess that's what the film does as well, isn't it? It talks
Yes,
about kind of funerals, but actually it was really good that he said there are different things that we mourn. And it does link to also the other film, Blessed Are Those Who Hunger and Thirst for Righteousness, that idea of the prophetic or prophets having this deep sense of grief, and wanting the world to be better, and that kind of sense of anguish because of it. And we see that in kind of some of the climate protests and the climate pilgrimages that are kind of featured in that film. This sense of we mourn, we can also mourn what the future could have been like, or a future that no longer seems possible. So yes, different types of mourning.
Vanessa's journey was really interesting, wasn't it? It was at odds with the established church and her longing for the righteousness in the climate crisis. I thought it was also really interesting that she stepped back from, she was initially involved with Extinction Rebellion, but stepped back from that because she felt that it had this danger, as was mentioned earlier, of self-righteousness or almost of being illegal as well, and has gone more for these vigils. I thought that was an interesting step, which almost speaks to meekness in the way she did it. But what were the things that struck you in particular in the hunger and thirst for righteousness in that film about climate crisis?
Well, I think I was struck by one of the things that she talked about was, it connects to what Rebecca has said about creation, where she says that you have to go outside. Like a lot of what they did, the kind of climate pilgrimages or the events that they did, some of which I had been at, so I was kind of trying to look at where I was in that footage. They were walking through very familiar bits of London, places that I have been, places by the river or places in parks or on roads. And she talked about the need to notice what's going on. And in order to notice things, you cannot be kind of sat in your room by yourself. You've kind of got to take yourself out into creation. And that creation for her is a creation that is groaning, is in mourning itself.
Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Jolyon, we don't feel particularly satisfied about the climate crisis, but of course, this beatitude talks about the hunger and thirst leading to being satisfied. What did you get of that from this film?
For me, this spoke very loudly of being unsatisfied, dissatisfied with the current status quo. It didn't show us burning forests. It didn't show us plastic on beaches. Instead, it showed us a number of people protesting, hungering, thirsting for righteousness, but particularly for climate righteousness. Part of the power of this film was that it didn't say, we're better than you. It simply said, we're all in this together, and this is a really tough situation, and we need to change. And the very simple climate pilgrimages, the simple walking together, simple protesting, in one way could be quite annoying to watch. And yet, because they were saying, well, let's just not be self-righteous about this, we're part of a whole system, there was a simplicity in that statement, and that living outdoors, but also being attentive to the outdoors, even though the outdoors and the indoors is under threat because of this overhunger, overthirst for stuff, which actually may be consuming and leading us and this blue planet down an abyss.
And Jolyon, more generally, I mean, there are plenty of climate films. I can think of An Uncomfortable Truth and others like that. But more generally about hunger and thirst for righteousness and being satisfied, where should we look in the cinematic universe to see examples of this subject being talked about?
A whole genre of journalistic films, investigative journalists. You can think of films such as All the President's Men, or more recently films like She Said or Spotlight, which highlight, for example, the Me Too or the Harvey Weinstein abuse and rapes and so on, or Spotlight highlighting the paedophile acts and abusive priests in Boston. Those are very powerful films because they tell often very simple stories of terrible things that are happening behind closed doors. So here you have the power of cinema challenging another power, and in a way sometimes raising really tough questions about apparently invulnerable institutions that are no longer invulnerable. Of course, you've got Julia Roberts in a more dated film, but Erin Brockovich, who is also calling companies to account. So you have the, if you like, the whistleblower film, which says this has to stop. And again, films that are doing that there's a long tradition of them that you can see, but I think it's, as you say, it's a powerful cinematic tradition.
Our next film was The Blessed are the Merciful, They Shall Receive Mercy. Rebecca, this was Professor of Christianity, Ben Quash. You know him well, I think, but it was his examination of that iconic medieval altarpiece, which is already featured in a feature film because it was stolen by the Nazis in the Second World War. So it became sort of something of the star of the film, The Monuments Men. But I'm interested in what you feel came out about merciful in that, in Ben's description of the altarpiece.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think, when he is discussing the two groups of people in the altarpiece who the artist chose to represent the merciful, he says, these might be surprising choices, which I think they are. So they're the just judges and then the knights of Christ. And but one of Ben Quash's points about both of these two people, which I thought was so insightful, was that where there is strength, that strength needs to be tempered by mercy. And so it actually made me think, I wonder if depicting these two groups as the merciful was not so much that they were merciful people, but that they needed to be merciful people in order to fulfill their duties well. So I wondered if, in a sense, it wasn't descriptive, but aspirational, that in fact, if you are a person of strength or power or voice, that you must exercise your office with mercy. So I'd never really thought of it that way before, that in fact, this description of these two groups might in fact be sort of an invitation or a charge, rather than saying, well, these people are obviously the merciful, because of course we know many cases in which those two groups of people in fact are not merciful. And so that was one of the things that really struck me about his analysis of those two groups in particular. But the other thing that struck me is that, of course, he said, the just judges and the Knights of Christ are on one of the wings. They're kind of on the outer panels, and then mirrored directly across on the other outer panels are the people who represent the meek. So it's the pilgrims and the hermits. And he said, if the just judges and the Knights of Christ essentially represent more kind of upper class people, they're wealthy, they're more powerful. You have the pilgrims and the hermits who are the lower class, who are people who don't have power or voice traditionally in society, and they're more kind of everyday people. And so the fact that they're kind of balanced visually in that way, I thought was also really, really striking.
Sam, I wonder if I could just bring you in here, because this is a bit off-piste here, so I hope this doesn't take you too by surprise. I have to say that if I visit your church, which is St. Martin's in the Fields in London, and stand there for any length of time, I find myself in the midst of some extraordinary iconography. There's the National Gallery, which I can go in and look at a Caravaggio if I want some reflection, or indeed the wonderful kind of crown of thorns glasswork in your church. But I'm thinking of the fourth plinth here, because in this sense of speaking truth to power and power needing mercy, there is something quite interesting about the way that fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square has been used to explore iconography around truth and power, isn't there? I'm thinking perhaps of the Ecce Homo image, that was there. I think it may have been the first installation on the plinth. Do you have anything to sort of say around that? It must be a fascinating thing to watch those installations come on the fourth plinth, because all the rest are very imperial, very powerful images, and we don't really associate those huge statues with mercy.
You may be aware that the latest installation, which was just installed 3 weeks ago, is the inverted masks of 763 trans women from Mexico. And it is, and its launch was a real statement, because a number of those women were present and took the microphone, spoke in Spanish for quite a considerable length of time, which was quite challenging to most of the people there who weren't Spanish speakers. But it was quite a beatitude moment, where it was a bit of a takeover by a group of excluded people. And the exhibit itself is clearly a statement of, if not solidarity, at least offering awareness about global minorities in a global city. St. Martin's has somewhat capitalized on this trajectory that you've described by recognizing that since 2008, I think was when the first fourth plinth was created. About the same time, the schools in London started having a children's competition for what the children would put on a fourth plinth. So last week at St. Martin's in our Lightwell, which is a potential exhibition space, we actually celebrated the unveiling of the fifth plinth, which was for children's art. And we did exactly what we're talking about, I guess, in this conversation, which was we explored the ways in which children might have something to say to the grown-ups of the world that the grown-ups of the world didn't already know. What a strange idea. But it's a profoundly Beatitudes idea. So I think you're absolutely right in your question.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really good. I love the idea. There's something wonderful about childlikeness, not childishness. And there's a great mistake made by many adults is to associate the two things together. And we're told by Jesus a childlike view of the world is what we need. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. In the cinematic world, I've already mentioned the Monuments Men, since that actually featured the Ghent altarpiece, which was stolen by the Nazis in the Second World War. But where else might we look, Jolyon, for an exploration of Blessed are the Merciful in film?
The obvious answer to that would be in spy films or in war films, where the hero or heroine has the chance to kill the baddie and doesn't, and shows mercy. Sometimes that comes back to bite you, because if you don't kill them, they end up killing you. And I can think of lots of examples of that. I think, for example, in Saving Private Ryan, there's one example of that. But I like to turn the question on its head and think about one of my favorite films. It's A Wonderful Life. You'll remember this is where the figure played by James Stewart is really depressed with life and comes to kill himself. And then his guardian angel stops him jumping off the bridge effectively, and shows him what the world would be like without him. If James Stewart, the character, was not there, then the world would be a much poorer place. So the film for me is showing how it's good to be merciful to yourself, to show kindness to yourself in a world where we're encouraged to be driven by perfection, by excellence. Perhaps this film is showing us a way of actually to live with imperfection, to play amidst the ruins, to recognize that our life will never be fully complete, never fully satisfied in the way that we'd like it to be, but part of living well is living mercifully for ourselves and also therefore for others as well.
Thank you. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Now, this was a film which, this is a really interesting exploration, because it was with a mental health nurse, Paula, in the Midlands, and seeking where purity of heart can be found. And I found this both a surprising and revealing journey. And I think, Chinny, you were the same. You had a particular reaction to this film as well.
Yes, it was quite harrowing for a short film. And I guess I did find myself while watching it thinking, which one is this again? Who is the pure in heart? Is it the patients, or is it the nurse, the medical professional? But I think for me, what really struck me is the "for they will see God." You know, whoever that is, whether it's that the patients or the medical professional. It was that moment where she talks about patients asking, "Why are you being kind to me? Why are you helping me?" And she describes how she realized that maybe they had never experienced love. And so there is something about her action, all the actions of all the staff there who do a job that I just absolutely could not do, because of all that they face. It is in that moment of choosing to love anyway, that the patients see God, even though they might not recognize that that's what God is, or that God is love, or even have ever heard anything like that. They experience something of what it is to be loved, and they don't understand it because it's not in their experience. So I ended up thinking that it is the patients who are the pure in heart in some way, or it's them who are being referred to in this in the kind of interpretation of it. But whoever it is, it's the "for they will see God."
See God where? Jolyon, I need to come to you for a response to this film, and where do we see people seeing God?
The obvious answer is we look at that in, for example, biblical epics, that we look at the Ten Commandments, we look at films about Moses, we look at films about Jesus of Nazareth, and we see there the word becoming flesh, or prophets pointing to God, And there are moments when we see God, or do we see God, or God is hidden, or we just have Charlton Heston's voice. Now that's the kind of obvious answer. I suppose the other answer is to think about, where do we see God in terms of through the narrative, through the characters, through the filmmaking. The filmmaking might be just through some very powerful, simple shots. Something like Bergman's films, the sort of trilogy of Faith and Doubt, for example, in The Seventh Seal. Famously, you have the knight saying, I want to see God, and yet not seeing God, but seeing death. And yet, at the end of the film, you have this dance of death, but there's something quite hopeful about the dance of death as well, because beside the dance of death, there's a family eating strawberries. So there's this hopeful moment in this classic 1950s film. And then also, it's not just what you see, but also in what you hear or don't hear. Filmmakers such as Tarkovsky and other sort of great filmmakers use silence really effectively, because it's in the silence, into the great silence, as the famous sort of monastic film. It takes us into the silence that might be a way of seeing God in that which is not spoken, that is in that which is not heard, that which is not seen. So you've got a whole range of films to reflect on there.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God, or in this particular case, heroes, I suppose. Jolyon, what are your responses to this film?
Of all the films, it's the one I least like. I find it the most difficult to watch and the most troubling. That's partly because I've worked in Rwanda soon-ish after the genocide, and have been to a number of the killing churches, and the experience there changed the way I think I do my work as an academic and think about journalism and broadcasting. So to hear their voices was a reminder of the hours of scripts, of witnesses, of eyewitnesses' testimonies that I've either heard, listened to, watched. And in a way, it's a tip of an iceberg of heartbreak and a history of blood. And therefore, for me, the film was a difficult watch. It shouldn't be an easy watch, and I'm aware that we should also walk carefully, respectfully, and humbly around what happened there, this extraordinary acts, and I do mean extraordinary acts of bravery and hopeful bravery. I learned something I didn't know about this, because I didn't realize that so many people actually been killed at this school. And of course, again, it's a genocide that claimed around 800,000 people in 100 days. And this was after the genocide. And yet the response was powerfully hopeful, because it showed the ethnic divides that had been in place by colonial powers, or reinforced by colonial powers, were being broken down by the very people who were caught in the midst of this terrible thing that happened in 1994, and of course has a long history. So as a film, it left me uneasy and troubled, but I think that's because of my own personal experience and understanding of what happened there over 30 years ago.
It is a moving story, because, of course, it is an interview with the people who were in that classroom and who were themselves injured or traumatized, or both, by the experience. Rebecca, what did you draw from this in particular?
Yeah, like you said, it was such a moving story, and the testimony of those three people, who had been there in the classroom that day, I just found so moving. I think a few things struck me about it. I mean, one was, and they didn't sort of narrate this themselves, but I just thought the courage that it took for them to, in the face of death, to hold to their principle that no, we are all Rwandans. We, in a sense, they were saying we would rather die than lapse back into that old pattern of hatred of one another. Like that's a remarkable testimony, right? That this is something literally they've decided this is worth dying for, which, it made me think about what are the things that we consider to be worth dying for. What would I die for? So that was one thing that struck me. One of the I believe it was one of the women talked in particular about the necessity of forgiveness for the work of peacemaking. which I also thought was, you can see how important that is, but also how incredibly difficult it is. So it really, I think, brought to the fore how costly forgiveness can be, that it's not just a kind of easy, like, oh, don't worry about it, you know, but it's this really costly act, choosing to forgive someone who has harmed you in such, you know, such visceral ways. Which for me was another connection to the blessing on the merciful, because of course, one of the ways that mercy has been interpreted in the past is precisely as forgiveness, that forgiving someone, especially someone who might not be deserving of forgiveness, is an act of mercy toward them. And then I think the last thing that struck me was at the very end, one of them talked about, you know, the unconditional love that is part of this process of peacemaking. Again, what depths of yourself you have to go to find unconditional love for people who have shown violence or hatred toward you. I love Chine's phrase earlier about that these are deep postures, and that's a deep posture, right? To have unconditional love for your enemies. And the person in particular said, if you don't love, you don't know God. And that, of course, is almost a direct quotation from scripture, but in that particular context, what a remarkable claim. And I thought that illustrates so beautifully the second half of this beatitude, right? Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. And it shows like, well, that's why they're children of God, right? Is because they show this kind of love and unconditional love that mirrors God's own heart. So I just thought it was such a great illustration of the second half of that beatitude.
That was interesting, wasn't it? Because they also they recognize they've been made national heroes. They have a kind of particular status, and in fact, the girl who was killed is the highest status of hero in Rwanda. But it clearly wasn't something they were wearing as a badge of honor or a medal or anything like that. So again, it's one of those fluid moments when you think there's a great deal of kind of self-effacing nature about that. We haven't really touched on meekness, but I just want to use that as an excuse to go there for a moment with you, Rebecca, because it'd be easy to see the self-effacing and the humble as meekness, and yet in your book you challenge the contemporary idea of meekness as simply being, oh, not me, or any kind of false humility. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you think that might be different to how meekness has been seen through the generations?
Yeah, so this was by far and away the most surprising thing that I found in my exploration of the Beatitudes, is that up until about the 18th or even the 19th century, meekness was understood in a very different way from how we typically understand the word meek today in English. And it was understood to be a virtue, and it was understood to be a kind of strength of character that had to do with how you handle anger. So meekness was defined over and over and over again as the ability to restrain your anger. So to exercise anger in the right way, for the right length of time, and for the right reasons. So meekness doesn't mean that you never get angry or you're a kind of timid or self-effacing person, but it's someone who is able to rightly restrain your anger so that you don't become so angry that you hurt other people with your anger, or so that you hold a grudge, or so that you fly off the handle and lose your temper at small things. And I just thought, what, that's what meekness is. That is so different from what I think of it as. And I actually think a slightly better translation of the word meek from the Greek is the word gentle, because the Greek word that means meek can also mean gentle. And I thought actually gentle, I think, captures it a little more clearly, because gentleness is this quality again of someone who a gentle person isn't going to strike out at you or hurt you. And we also it's not common, but we still use the word gentle as a verb, right? To gentle a wild horse. And this is actually one of the images that some classical thinkers use to express the virtue of meekness, that it's kind of like taking the wild horse of anger, if you will, and gentling it. So it's under your control. And I just think what a remarkable thing. One of the so the exemplar that I chose at the start of every chapter of my book, I chose a kind of exemplar or exemplars of people who live out this beatitude in some way. And I chose Frederick Douglass for one reason. So Frederick Douglass was born an enslaved person in the state of Maryland, the state I currently live in the United States. He gained his freedom and became one of the leading abolitionists, and he was a fiery preacher. You know, if you read his sermons, he denounced what he called white Christianity. You know, a Christianity who didn't think twice about enslaving a fellow member of the human race. So he was this, you know, he was a very fiery, powerful speaker. But one of his fellow abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison, describes him as a meek person. And I thought, really, Frederick Douglass, a meek person. Why meek? Well, it's because Garrison is using this older understanding of the word meek as someone who can rightly use and control their anger. So Douglass is angered at the right things, right? He's angered at the enslavement of human beings. That's a thing that is worth getting angry about. And so that's why, you know, Garrison can describe him as meek, I think. But this really overturned my understanding of that particular beatitude.
Well, I think that's really helpful. It rather spoils my enjoyment of the Eddie Izzard sketch on meekness, which if you're listening to the podcast, you may want to go away and look up, but I'm not going to put a link in this. But it is very funny. But that entirely depends, and I think perhaps contemporary kind of humor depends on that. The old adage of the little piece of graffiti, the meek will inherit the earth, if that's right with the rest of you.
Yeah,
is that
exactly.
kind of that self-effacing kind of quality to it. I think that's a very interesting angle. Well, I think we should come into land with blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And this is in Matthew's recording of it. There's an echo, a second iteration. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And this was the second of our two films, which I thought were, you know, hugely traumatic experiences, largely beyond the daily lives of many of us. And this was the story of the persecution of some Persians who had been put in prison for their faith. And remarkably, the blessings they speak of. Rebecca, again, you were particularly touched by this one.
I was so moved by their testimony. I found the line drawings that were drawn during their narration very moving. There was one in particular of, you couldn't tell what it was at first, but it became an image of children holding hands and playing, which I just thought the kind of joy that expressed in relation to these narrations of great suffering and harm really points to that reward that you just cited, that you just quoted. You know, when you are persecuted, rejoice. In Luke's version, it actually says leap for joy, because great is your reward in heaven. And how difficult that must be. And I mean, I've never faced anything like what these people faced, but for them to still hold on to this sense of joy and not to be, you know, have kind of lapsed into bitterness, I thought was such a remarkable part of their testimony. One of the other things that one of them mentioned was that he wondered about the people who were torturing him. He said, how can they, you know, presumably they torture me and then they go home and they kiss their daughter, they hug their wife, they have dinner with their family. How can they do that? How can they, you know, do they have any regrets about torturing me, or can they just literally do this and go home and it's no big deal? And said, some of them seem to actually take enjoyment in the torture, whereas others of them, he said some of the soldiers actually found it very difficult to do the torturing. And I thought that's such an insightful question. If, of course, the blessing is for the persecuted, it immediately raises the question of, well, what about the persecutor? Presumably there's a kind of corresponding woe to the persecutor. But what of those people? Like, what leads them to persecute? Are they simply following orders and they find it actually quite distasteful, or is there a kind of enjoyment they're taking in their persecution? So I thought that was such an interesting question, such an interesting way to kind of think about the person who's causing all of this harm.
For me, the understatement of what had happened through the cinematic choice to use line drawings was a well-chosen piece of filmmaking, because it allowed us to focus on the story. And the story, of course, is a troubling one. It's a traumatic one. It's one that's happening now as well as happening historically. But for me, it allowed us to focus very clearly on what had happened there in Iran. My own experience of working in Iran was actually the opposite, of being welcomed, of having the red carpet put out, of being felt that I was a VIP. So to watch that, I thought, gosh, at the same time as I was being welcomed and hosted so lavishly and generously, this was also happening. So again, it allowed me to think differently about my own visit, and also about the place there and the people, because of course it's easy to see this as defining of a people. It's one window onto a people who are a large nation, who have a rich historic religious tradition that is more than just Shia Islam. Of course, that's partly defining, but it's more than that. It's more than persecuting of Christians. It also raises questions about, what does it mean to be an Iranian person in this time and in this place? Ever since film began in the 1890s, it's captivated people's imaginations. But over the last 100, 120, 130 years, film has evolved, and it will continue to evolve. And in many ways, this project of turning this beautiful, this memorable, these unforgettable Beatitudes into cinematic parables, cinematic icons, is part of that process of cinematic evolution. And it's a way of saying that these texts are alive, they're well, and they're worth understanding and knowing and reliving, re-expressing and re-portraying in today's culture. Part of the power of doing it is long films. They may be epics, but they may also be short ones, cinematic parables that are only a few minutes, that will captivate our imagination and hold our attention, but also not just motivate us and move us, but also change how we live and how we behave. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, a little bit later, says, don't worry about tomorrow. Don't be anxious. Consider the lilies of the field. Consider the birds of the air. There's something here that is almost cinematic in saying, just stop and look and attend the world. And part of the gift of filmmaking is that it can attend not just the lilies of the field, not just the birds of the air, but also this beautiful world in which we live, fragile as it is, bruised as it is, and yet there's so much beauty to celebrate. Filmmaking can celebrate beauty and then encourage us to want to bring beauty, compassion, and love in our lives and in the world around us.
Well, I feel that's a wonderful place to conclude our podcast. And I want to thank all of our guests today, Chinny, Rebecca, Sam, and Jolyon, for joining us. And thank you for joining us on this journey of the climb. I hope you'll stay with us and journey some further in the future. Chris Payne, who directed the documentaries, said that his job was to shine a light onto the truth of these Beatitudes. And initially the brief was kind of, whoa, these are huge. How do you capture them? But it's actually not your job to capture all of it. Just get a little glimpse of it. What we would love to do is to make these into a longer form so that it immerses an audience for a longer time in the emotional journey of each of these Beatitudes. Imagine an hour-long TV episode or cinematic experience that draws you into the Beatitude. What might you hope would be in one of those? What would you hope it would do? I'll come to you first, Rebecca.
I think my hope is that it would do something very much like what these documentaries did, is show the variety of the ways that any individual beatitude can flower in a human life, in everyday situations. So one of the things we know from looking at sort of past, like, visual depictions of the Beatitudes is that they were everywhere. They were in medieval manuscripts, and they were in stained glass windows, and there were multiple kind of exemplars who were held up as examples of the Beatitudes. But there was never just one person who was like, this is the exemplar of the Beatitude. It was a multitude of people from different parts of the world and different social classes, and so I think as the director Chris Payne also said, you're giving people a glimpse. You're not saying this is the wholeness that this beatitude is, in, because you can't capture that in one film, right? But this is a window into what it might look like. In fact, what it does look like in this particular concrete setting, which then helps spark our imaginations about what it might look like in other concrete settings, right? So I think that would be my hope.
Ginny, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think there is the power of film, the power of storytelling is the kind of individual human ways into profound truths, isn't it? So I think a continuation of what these short films have already done, which is talking about the Beatitudes through a person or people's stories, people that I can in some way connect with. And I think if the kind of a longer exploration of these could draw out some of what we've spoken about, which is the interconnectedness of them. So you know how in some Disney films you've got kind of characters or images or bits from other films that kind of appear in but aren't kind of necessarily spoken about. The connection between the different films and the different Beatitudes, and finding a way to signify that. But also there are things I love, a Channel 4 series called the I Am series. And this has been kind of, I think there have been a few series now, but each episode is a different woman's name. I Am Ruth is one, or I can't remember all of their names. And what connects them is that they are women, but their stories are very, very different. They are different races, different ages. They're talking about what it is to be a woman or a human being in today's society. It might be about coercive control, or it might be about aging, or it might be about freezing your eggs, or it might be about parenting a child with kind of social media addiction. But what I love about them is that they start, if I think about the opening scenes of those episodes, it's kind of almost like we'll start with someone's eye or a hand or a one person, and then almost expand by the end of the episode into something absolutely huge, harrowing, profound. So I think, again, so the individual to the profound, making that connection, I think, is the beauty that of film.
Thank you. That's a really wonderful thing. And in fact, this whole project began with a consideration of the Decalogue, which was a series made about the Ten Commandments set on a council estate in Poland. And that was one of our inciting reasons for exploring this. And that did indeed do just what you've described, Ginny, in that it all had this locatedness. And as you said, Rebecca, it was a concrete place, but different characters who brushed past each other or collided with one another, but each embodied an experience of the Ten Commandments, which is what that was around. Well, I hope that at some point in the future, I may have the pleasure of inviting you all back for a consideration of how that next stage of our journey up the mountainside has gone. But for now, I want to thank you so much for being here for The Climb.